On this Thursday night, an act of terrorism. The pivotal ruling over an Ontario man's deadly attack on a Muslim family. His sentence and the loved ones still grieving.
The verdict will not bring back what was stolen.
Nazis who fled to Canada.
They didn't conduct proper investigations.
The hunt for those who may have escaped justice for atrocities during the Holocaust. Plus, Canadians keeping up the fight in Ukraine as fatigue sets in for its defense against Russia.
It does definitely wear on you for sure, being in those positions.
And saving history, preserving North America's largest wooden church in Nova Scotia.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Neetu Garcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. An Ontario judge has ruled the man convicted of first-degree murder and attempted murder for deliberately striking a Muslim family with his truck also committed an act of terrorism. Speaking after the ruling, members of the Afzaal family said more must be done to fight hate in Canada.
The terrorism designation acknowledges the hate that fueled this fire, the ugliness that took the lives of Talat, Salman, Madiha, and Yumna. But this hate didn't exist in a vacuum. It thrived in the whispers, the prejudices, the normalized fear of the other. All of these played their part in the tragedy that unfolded.
The killer was sentenced to life in prison and was also handed a concurrent life sentence for attempted murder. Our Seán O'Shea was in court for today's sentencing hearing. Seán?
Neither one community member described today as a mix of heartbreak and hope. Heartbreak at the loss of those Muslim family members 3 years ago. Hope that people outside this community may be paying attention to this historic ruling. A family and a community shattered by what can now be called an act of terrorism.
The scars, physical and emotional, will remain. But we choose not to reply to hate with more hate.
How are we going to create change? How are we going to work together to make a better Canada?
Nathaniel Veltman drove his new pickup truck into 5 members of the Afzaal family out for a walk in London, Ontario. 4 died, a young boy survived. A jury convicted Veltman of first-degree murder and attempted murder after a 10-week trial. Superior Court Justice Renee Pomerantz ruled on Thursday Veltman was a white supremacist whose actions were an act of terrorism. Speaking for nearly an hour and a half, she called Veltman's act barbaric and a textbook case committed by a lone wolf who hated Muslims. On top of the 4 life sentences for murder, she also handed Veltman a life sentence for attempted murder, a sentence available because of the federal terrorism charges.
Our only hope is that today's ruling will bring some sense of justice, some measure of comfort, and some closure.
It's a closing of a chapter, just a chapter. It's not the whole book is not closed.
Veltman's defense lawyers said they're waiting for instructions on what to do next.
Well, there may be a conviction and sentence appeal. We'll see.
But for Muslims who said Veltman's actions left them afraid to cross the street, the ruling is meaningful.
I also hope that we are perhaps finally ready, after today's sentencing, to see white supremacy as being capable of terrorism.
Targeted, heinous, and hate-motivated attacks like this one are acts of terrorism, and perpetrators will and must face the full extent of the law.
In her ruling, Justice Pomerantz refused to name the killer by name. Instead, he was called simply the offender. Going forward, he could be called something else, convicted terrorist. Neetu.
Seán O'Shea in London tonight. Thanks, Seán. Palestinians searched through the rubble of a flattened mosque in Rafah today after one of the heaviest nights of shelling in Gaza's southernmost city. At least 7 people were killed and dozens more wounded. The Hamas-run health ministry says nearly 100 deaths have been recorded in Gaza over the past 24 hours. In the West Bank, a shooting near an Israeli settlement left at least 1 person dead and 5 others injured. 3 Palestinian gunmen are said to have opened fire at cars stuck in traffic. 2 of the gunmen were shot dead, while a 3rd was injured and taken into custody. The IDF conducted raids in the West Bank following the attack, and there are reports Israeli troops clashed with rioters near Bethlehem. There are renewed calls for the federal government to unseal records related to Canada's Nazi war crimes files. The Liberal government moved to release previously classified details earlier this month, but advocates say greater transparency is needed as hundreds of suspected Nazis have never faced prosecution. A Canadian woman is pushing to bring the few surviving suspects to justice. Jeff Semple has exclusive information in this global news investigation and a warning some of the details in this report are disturbing.
This Star of David marks the spot where Jewish civilians were executed in 1941 when the Nazis invaded this Lithuanian city of Raseiniai, and evidence suggests some of those involved in the massacre may have escaped to Canada.
Accused war criminals, people that the government claimed were not in Canada, I was able to locate.
Professor Abbee Corb is an expert in extremism who has worked with police and intelligence agencies around the world. And she's a Nazi hunter.
Most of them refugees who have already fled from persecution.
After the Second World War, Canada welcomed more than 150,000 refugees. And Corb says many Nazis slipped through the cracks. Their names were sent to Canadian authorities and passed down to members of the Jewish community. In 2017, Corb became the custodian of hundreds of Nazi war crimes files and conducted her own investigations.
I found a lot of them.
Corb says dozens of suspected Nazis are still alive, and one case captured her attention from that Lithuanian city of Raseiniai. Written testimony from a survivor named Dina Zeiss-Flum described how Jews were rounded up. She hid in a barn under the hay and watched.
Laying in the barn, I could well see two women standing at the pit, small children's heads being hit with heavy stones, or one head at the other child's head. One of the women was the student Klimaita.
The student Klimaita. No first name was provided, but those clues gave investigators a place to start.
This same story came up in 3 or 4 different Holocaust testimonies, 2 of which gave the same name.
Immigration records revealed 2 names that matched, Lithuanian sisters who arrived in Canada in 1948. The eldest sister, Joanna, was 18 at the time Flum claimed to have seen the student Klimaita killing small children. Joanna Klimaita listed her occupation as student, and her birthplace was about 70 kilometers from Raseiniai. In the 1990s, under pressure from Jewish groups, the RCMP launched investigations into hundreds of suspected Nazis, including Klimaita.
They didn't conduct proper investigations.
Police documents show investigators never visited Raseiniai or found the witness, Dina Flum, due to time constraints and higher priority files. It also appears police never spoke with the Canadian suspect, Klimaita. Global News recently tracked down a Lithuanian woman named Joanna, maiden name Klimaita, who lived in Ontario, but it was too late.
Okay, I'm Jeff. I'm with Global News.
She died a couple of years ago at 99. Her children said they know nothing about the allegations in Raseiniai. Much of her file, along with hundreds of others, remains redacted.
It's frustrating.
Mark Fryman's parents survived the Holocaust. The former Deputy Attorney General for Ontario has been working with Corb for years, lobbying the government to release Canada's Nazi war crimes files.
I think a lot of the files contain embarrassing revelations about the Canadian government, the Canadian police, the Canadian prosecution service.
Of the more than 1,500 RCMP investigations, none of the suspected Nazis have ever been successfully prosecuted. And given the advanced age of the surviving suspects, time is running out. Jeff Semple, Global News, Toronto.
Global News is airing a special report, Rising Hate, Anti-Semitism in Canada. You can watch that on Saturday at 7 p.m. With Russia's full-scale war on Ukraine dragging into its 3rd year this weekend, there are fewer recruits looking to enlist. Both sides have suffered extraordinary losses. In Ukraine, families are pushing for loved ones to return home and stay longer for badly needed rest. Foreign fighters, including Canadians, are attempting to help fill the void. Crystal Goomansingh is back in Ukraine and spoke with some Canadian troops about the front lines, the fatigue, and what allies can do to help.
My family's really supportive in all this.
Winter in Ukraine looks and feels a lot like it does on the prairies. But this isn't Edmonton. It's Izum. And we caught up with Jesse just before he was set to head back out to the front line.
It'll harden you and make you pretty tough pretty quick.
Previously, he was a paratrooper with the Canadian Armed Forces. Since March 2022, the proud Ukrainian Canadian has been working to repel invading Russian forces. First around Kyiv, then Zaporizhia. Now his unit is positioned near Bakhmut.
Every single battle it's been overwhelming Russian artillery hammering our positions and significantly less shells going back towards the Russians.
Munitions, weapons, and items for soldiers such as night vision goggles are still needed. Getting these items into Ukraine in a timely manner is still problematic. Canada this week announced more than 800 sophisticated drones with night capabilities for Ukraine. Delivery is slated for the spring. The money for them was announced in June of last year. Still, allied nations such as Canada say Ukraine has their total support. Dave Smith, who is also fighting for Ukraine, disagrees.
Fixed military procurement, both for my own, brothers and sisters back in the Canadian Armed Forces, but also just to be a reliable international partner when it comes to global security.
Smith requested voluntary release from the Canadian Armed Forces so he could fight for Ukraine. He was last on the front lines in early December. Soldiers, he says, don't get to stop operations when supplies run low. The operations just become more dangerous. Ukraine doesn't release soldier fatality numbers, saying only their losses are not as high as the Russians. We do know there is a push to replenish the ranks. Late last year, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the military leadership asked for up to 500,000 new recruits.
It does definitely wear on you for sure, being in those positions with the amount of drones and how much the Russians have here. But everyone here still is highly motivated.
Mobilization efforts mean billboards are everywhere. This one reads, "The victory is in your hands. Join the army." Contentious legislation is also moving through Ukraine's parliament. The latest version includes lowering the draft age from 27 to 25 and making basic military service compulsory for males 18 to 25.
Mentally preparing yourself to go fight is the best way to get ready for a fight. But it's a lot easier to do when you know that you have F-16s and 155 shells and you have the tools required to do the job.
There are soldiers from all over the world fighting here in Ukraine. The Canadians we spoke with say they know the risks and they also know what's at stake. They hope allies of Ukraine will continue to support them as long as it takes. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, Kharkiv region, Ukraine.
The mother of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has now been shown her son's body, but says Russian authorities are trying to blackmail her into a secret burial.
Вчера же вечером они тайно отвезли меня в морг, где показали.
She says she spent nearly 24 hours with Russian officials and was told he died of natural causes, but his remains won't be released until she agrees to a private funeral. She rejected the demand. Navalny died last Friday in a penal colony. Today, his wife Yulia and daughter Dasha met with U.S. President Joe Biden in California. He says Navalny's legacy of courage will live on in them and those fighting for democracy and human rights. Biden says Russian President Vladimir Putin is responsible for Navalny's death and sanctions will be announced tomorrow. This is the image Putin is projecting in Russia today. He took the co-pilot seat in a nuclear-capable bomber, a move widely seen as bolstering his leadership and a reminder of Russia's nuclear superpower status. The plane can carry 24 missiles and fly 12,000 kilometers nonstop. Past their prime, ahead the problems with Via Rail's aging train cars. Via Rail is warning it might have to cut service along some of its Canada-wide routes in the coming years because of aging, outdated passenger rail cars. The Crown Corporation's network covers around 10,000 kilometers, but with the majority of its cars already decades past their intended lifespan, they're only getting harder to maintain. As Mike Armstrong explains, Via is hoping to get the green light from Ottawa to start purchasing a new fleet before time runs out.
With every year, the challenge grows. Via Rail's fleet is getting older and older. The long-distance passenger rail cars were bought in the 1940s and 50s. And for the crews at the Montreal maintenance facility, keeping them going isn't easy.
They make parts out of nothing because you can't even order parts for these trains anymore. That's how old they are.
Via has about 11 different types of long-distance rail cars: sleepers, berths, dining cars. There are about 200 running right now, but that number's shrinking. It's pulled 25 rail cars from service because they couldn't be repaired any longer, and that's not going to stop.
We'll probably have to continue to remove year after year some cars, and eventually it will impact the number of cars available for service.
Well, to explain that warning, Via took journalists on a tour of the facility Thursday. It says it needs to start the process of purchasing new rail cars soon, or cuts are coming. Proposals have been made to Transport Canada. Talks are underway because the status quo isn't an option.
By 2035, if we haven't injected new cars in, we will be stopping service, our coast-to-coast service altogether. Now, we're not there yet.
Now, Via officials say they don't have a concrete estimate for the cost of replacing the fleet, but it would likely be a few $1 billion. That's a big ask of Ottawa, and comes just a few years after it got $1.5 billion to upgrade intercity trains in the Windsor-Quebec City corridor. And it's not the only ask. Via is also pitching a proposal for a new high-frequency and faster service between Montreal and Toronto.
We're the last G7 country of not having a rapid long-distance train.
Now, Canada hasn't been upgrading its network as quickly as other countries. Long-distance passenger rail cars in Canada are on average twice the age of rail cars in the U.S. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
On its last legs, next, the pleas to save this historic Nova Scotia church.
As our equipment is on the surface of the moon, and we are transmitting.
That was the moment Odysseus landed on the moon's south pole late this afternoon. It's the first privately built craft to touch down on the moon's surface and the first by an American spacecraft in more than 50 years. Nova Scotia is at risk of losing a historic landmark. A church that's one of the largest wooden buildings in North America could be demolished soon. Heidi Petracek explains what would be lost.
It's a centerpiece of Nova Scotia's Acadian shore, one Pierre Comeau and André Valotaire have spent a decade trying to save. But time is running out.
The day that the wrecking ball would showed up would be one of the saddest days of my life.
Sainte-Marie's church has stood here since 1905, touted as the largest wooden church in North America, once the center of Catholic worship here.
It's just sad to think that it might not be here anymore.
The 56-meter spire is hard to miss. The interior, a feast for the eyes. But as worshipers decreased, maintenance costs ballooned. The roof sprung a leak, and the parish tried to fundraise $10 million for repairs. They got an offer from a donor whose identity they won't reveal.
Who offered to pay the entire costs of renovating the building.
But then the donor disappeared. So now the Archdiocese has the church up for sale for $250,000 as is.
The last time there was Mass here was Christmas Eve 2019. That's also the last time these pews were full of parishioners. The church was officially deconsecrated last November.
That's also when the furnace stopped working. The building's uncertain future, like so many other former churches.
This is a very significant problem nationally. The church as church buildings are very challenged to continue.
The heart says it's a monument, it's a beautiful building, it needs to be preserved, but the head says it's a money pit that there's no money to put into.
As repairs become more costly with time, community members say at this point saving it will take a miracle. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Church Point, Nova Scotia.
And that is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Neetu Garcha. Tonight's Your Canada is Crescent Lake in Roberts Arm, Newfoundland and Labrador. Thanks so much for watching and hope to see you here again tomorrow. Have a great night.